Good. This meeting is being recorded. I like that. No misunderstanding. Yes. Very fair.
It's
The
a
future policy.
yes. PowerPoint.
No. But she needs to be able to see as well. Look at that. There we go.
That's okay.
Is it good? Yeah. So now I can usually put it.
Down there. There. So if you press, look at that. It's amazing. Yeah.
Perfect.
Lovely. Skatoef.
Once again, our theory.
Okay.
Now close that.
And that was it. Thank you for coming. That was it. Thank you for coming. Nice.
Thank you, Talia.
Thank you, Sam.
I'm gonna wonder. Just have to double check.
We don't need to see all the other ones.
Where was the button?
Just go to the real
Do you want to go to full screen?
Yeah,
That one.
but I just want full screen.
Yeah, but that's next.
Because this one
there,
brings
there.
me to the presenter's view.
Yeah, but that's my presenter. That's okay.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Yeah. The recording is.
Yes.
Can you see it?
Thank you.
I'm gonna look in from another account on the Zoom. If you can accept me, I will make sure everything.
Fantastic.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Talia. Can you see the slide? Oh, this is good. So this is an ongoing research project that was established 2024. So we are now a bit more than 1 year in. Actually, it was established in the autumn of 2023. We had our first shadow meetings already back then, and we have been meeting in a lovely group of researchers. Wrong computer there, which is a dream team of researchers from Denmark, Norway, England, and Ireland. And what we're really trying to do is to take a look at the Nordic model, you could say, the model that we also have in Sweden, which is based on the Nordic model of society, the Nordic model of democracy, how our democratic infrastructure, distribution of responsibilities and power structures. And then the Anglophone model, the model that is running both Ireland and the UK. So Ben Walmsley, who's the professor and general manager of the Cultural Value Institute at Leeds University, also brings in all the research that they have been doing. And Heidi Stavron from the university in southern Norway is doing the same. Our good friend and colleague Stephen Hatley is doing the same from Ireland. Then we have this huge group of people of all the Danish universities, which are also all members of the Take Part network, which is a huge network of cultural participation and distribution in Denmark. More than 90 researchers have kind of landed in that. And our equivalent to the Myndigheden for Kulturanalyse in Sweden, which is an authority for cultural analysis, is called the Danish Kulturanalyse Institute, the Danish Cultural Analysis Institute. They are also there. So we have this semi-public funded research authority being part of the conversation as well. And the idea for us has been to see that so much has been taking place since the shift of the millennium. So many things has basically happened. In 2006, everything that was communicated from every given cultural operator had something on the internet, and then it was posted and printed. Most of it was printed in flyers and posters, and that was it. And they were very often shadowing each other. And most newspapers, most media had a cultural section, there was a cultural recipient infrastructure. It all existed, and it has more or less, with the internet being the newcomer in the 90s, it had more or less been the same since World War II. But in the zeros, it's completely atomized. And already from 2009-10 and onwards, you don't see the same media infrastructure. You see a completely new set of platforms that people operate on. Our gadgets have taken over. We do our self-declaration on our smartphones. We don't need ordinary anymore. We can do everything digitally, and it's getting more and more advanced as we go. So what the curiosity we looked in at is that reflected? Can we actually see that huge transition that we have undergone in terms of technology, that we have undergone in terms of globalization, of the global contract? Now Trump is trying to push us back before 2000, so maybe we will have to reinvent what it's like to print posters, and I don't know, but basically you could say that so many things has happened in a very short time span. And the research question is, of course, has culture and cultural policy developed alongside it? Or is that basically anchored in a world that doesn't really exist anymore? So, yeah, let's have some drums here.
But the city in the first slides, which one is that?
Bergen.
Oh.
If you have never been to Bergen,
I have never been to Bergen.
oh, go to Bergen. Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. Yeah, I'm going to Bergen in 2 months. I'm really kind of, oh, yes. And you can go up there on the top of the mountain, just look down, just remember your raincoat.
It's lovely.
Yeah, it's a genetic thing. People in Bergen can walk around in shorts, and then suddenly they're all dressed up like fishermen, and it takes less than 2 seconds. And as a foreigner, you're just getting wet.
Yeah.
And they're just laughing at you. But it's amazing. So we started off saying we want to explore what's the design, what can we actually, what are the aims of cultural policy today, what rationales and normative justifications underlie them, and what means can be used to achieve the desired goals. What are we talking about when we're talking about cultural infrastructure? And it can be important to know, which I haven't explained in the slides, but it can be important for you to know that whereas Norway in a way reflects Sweden in the terms that they too have regionalized cultural policy. There's a distribution of power from the state to the regional level. We don't have that in the same way in Denmark. It has been distributed from the state to the municipal level. You're basically representing the only region that has taken it on, but it's not really part of your curriculum in the regions, whereas a very important part of the Swedish distribution of money and funds, and likewise in Norway. So we wanted to investigate these questions. And wrong computer. And we did that. We did that saying, okay, so what we wanted to do is we wanted to see, okay, what's going on? So we wanted to collect, and we wanted to see if we can map significant changes in the policy making processes, and if we can see if there is happening things in the cultural economic priorities in Denmark over the last decades, and in Norway, Ireland, and England. And the answer is already from the very first meeting, absolutely. Absolutely. This also coming back to our conversation with Morten and Sebastian, there is always a much higher awareness, or already a much higher awareness of the necessity to identify different operators that we can actually work with, because it's no longer just limited into a classical infrastructure. There's so many other operators out there offering a lot of things. Bjarki Valtjesson, one of the researchers, is basically saying, when we're talking film and television distribution, the major cultural political actors are not anchored in the Nordic countries. They're based in streaming companies that have a completely different legislation, a completely different logic. They don't pay back into society unless we demand it. You know, it's a different relationship, and they're transnational. They have a different approach to, for instance, the value of Sunday evening entertainment on national television that has gathered the Danes for generations around Matador and Borgen, and you know.
Melody Festival.
Yeah, in Sweden, Melody Festival, and so forth. Yeah, exactly. Ubesitters, but which is a completely don't get into that because it's so different in Denmark. But we wanted to understand what is actually driving change and how are we dealing with that in a way. And then of course we wanted to see what does terms like development and quality mean in the formation of new initiatives, and to what extent are they representing a different take on, for instance, quality than we had before? Is quality stricted, connected to excellence, for instance, in the symphony orchestra, or is it also now connected to the idea of the whole event, the whole experience, the visitor experience, as you mentioned, from the very starting point of when did you hear about it till you leave, and how is that then reflected in actions, in demands, in public attention, etc. So all these issues are kind of embedded in here. Right, computer. So we see that already now from the very starting point of, for instance, public investment, navigation, attention, accessibility becomes an important part of it. And we want to see to what extent is that just driven by market logics, or to what extent is that actually driven about issues of relevance, for instance, relevance and resonance into different communities in a given society. So the why is basically that we already here see that, well, we have this Norwegian researcher, Per Mangset, who in 2018 said, well, what we are at is the end of cultural policy. At least we are at the end of cultural policy as we know it. And we might also be in the end of cultural policy as this icing on the cake understanding of culture, that it comes quite late, it's in its quite limited pipeline, and it's kind of the last thing that is on the priority list in the political composition on a local or regional level. That is probably different because culture is much more transversal. We have learned that culture plays a role for settlement policies, that culture plays a role for a lot of things. We even heard that today, that the dialogue with companies and understanding that the composition and the presence of culture is important for them to place their investments and loan, etc. So the culture policy agendas are quite interesting, and there is this transition taking place. And then, of course, we are also kind of looking into how do we, in terms of culture politics, address what we call wicked problems like migration, health, climate agendas, because we have these programs in Europe. There's a huge focus on culture for health and lots of health initiatives, and there's a website that your region is one of the initiators behind, with more than 600 cases, presenting how this is actually an important feature in the formation of cultural politics, from Cluj in Romania to Aarhus in Denmark to Skåne. Actually, it's also one of the partakers in this in Sweden. Right, computer, lovely image. So the challenge, of course, is to see how can we address cultural policy paradigms in a way where digital media, algorithms, and new platform-based communication infrastructures have influenced citizens' production and consumption patterns, because we can see that with the introduction of this one, everything changed. And we know too little about is the increased participation in Sweden and Denmark. Is that a result, basically, of a much more maybe even unaware social communication platform habit that we have integrated? Are we actually far better in reaching people also outside of the usual suspects than we were before, or are we not? And if we are not, why aren't we that good, and can we do it differently? One of the things that we have had quite a laugh about is that all institutions have it written they need to address young people aged 15 to 25. It says so. If you want our public money, you need to address young people aged 15 to 25. First of all, that's not one group. It's many different groups. when I was 25, I would never hang around with myself age 15 ever. You know, Niels 15 was in one stage of life. Niels 25 had 2 kids already and was in a different stage of life. Finalized university, settlements, apartments, life. Yeah. So just understanding that we can't have these broad categories, but how can we have them differently? And where are these people then? Where are our target groups? If it's young 18, 19-year-olds, where are they? They might be on TikTok, but if you're a public body in Denmark, you're not allowed to use TikTok. You're probably not allowed to use TikTok in Sweden either. So are we on the right platforms? Are we on the platforms that they use? Do we communicate in the right language? Do we communicate around the right issues? Is our cultural offerings, are they really relevant to those groups in all their aspects, not just as an aspect of beautiful music? For instance, as an example that came up in the study, most symphonic music written for an audience today is not written for a broad audience. They're written for the gaming communities. They're written for films and television. And there are lots of music lovers that don't know what it means to go to a concert hall and listen to Faulkner or Mahler. But they know what music means in their games, in their settings, in their communities, in their environments. Can we bridge those groups? Can we bridge those interests? Can we find ways that make sure that our concert halls and our fine orchestras can actually still serve a living audience and not a dying one? So those are issues, and Malmö Orchestra has done that, or Malmö Symphony Orchestra is doing that with their joystick concerts, one of the examples we've been looking into. So we're talking about values, we're talking about attributes, we're talking about systemical change, we're talking about political change, we're talking about depopulation is an issue for many municipalities in the Nordics. It's also an issue in Ireland. It's less of an issue in the UK because it happened earlier in the UK. So they are kind of a step ahead of us, you could say, that they have completely depopulated and underinvested and fragmented areas where they're really needing to find out what to do about it and how to address it, and that's on many different aspects. So we're looking into these challenges, right? Computer. How can our institutions become relevant to more people? What does that really mean? And are we still looking at these settings, these understandings of concert hall is a concert hall for those who understand what a concert hall is, or could it even be much more than that? And what is that then in terms of the formation of cultural politics? So we are looking into 3 different levels. We're looking into the rationales of cultural policy in the digital age, where we basically talk about how have these major changes in society affected the enactment of cultural policy rationales? How are cultural policy rationales formulated and affected nationally, regionally, and locally? And how the normative justifications and rationales of cultural policy? Are there even normative rationales that we can look at? And you could say, in a way, we can see that there are quite normative rationales. There are quite normative understandings. I'll come back to that in just a second. Then we're looking at evidence-based evaluations and consequences for cultural policy. Cultural policies have very much been a kind of ideological garden where understandings of culture is good for you. Culture will be good for you. You will simply become a better person if you go more to the museum. This bildning, dannelse, understanding of culture has an enormous significant role. When you look into the different political parties, even some of the left has this as a very significant part of their understanding of culture. It's good for the building of us as individuals, and by that, for us as society.
There is an ad from Folkhälsomyndigheten. Is it like the authority of people's health? That said just recently that I saw on my wall on Facebook that culture is good for your health. So it's still this narrative definitely.
But it's based on our our finding is basically that it's very often based on gut feelings. It's a gut feeling. We know too little about it. So one of the things that we really want to do is the second one here. What are the implications of data-driven policy making? Can we get more data on what it actually means for people? Can we really try to understand the value of culture and cultural participation, the value of social interaction, the value, as they were talking about, Morten and Sebastian, of investing in culture, creating a cultural infrastructure that might attract other people to settle, the settlement perspective, for instance, in it. And what would, in that case, an evidence-based cultural policy look like? What does it look like? And interestingly enough, within the last decade, Sweden first, and then Denmark and Norway has now established these national research institutions on culture and cultural policy. And we are producing an enormous amount of reports. And we want to, of course, to get on board and see, can we now start mapping what's the effect of all that knowledge? Is that effect even being used in the formation of cultural policy? Does the information about different groups being, for instance, left aside, influence the formation of cultural policy in Gothenburg or in Kungsbacka? Or, can we see that people are actually making use of evidence? Or is it evidence for research that is still politically irrelevant? That kind of reflections. And then, of course, we're looking into partnerships and business models. What happens? Well, can we find good examples where we can see the formation of policy being based on something that is slightly different than the traditional perception of culture, and see how that implicates policy making? For instance, processes of where we follow new actors, cash flows, new kind of partnerships. In Denmark, as well as in Ireland, a lot of the conversation is about what we call catalytic partnerships. That cultural institutions are far more interested in getting communities or individuals on board quite early in the process to co-create and co-curate together with them, to get a different nuance, instead of creating partnerships when we have taken care of content ourselves, and then we want you to engage because we want it to be disseminated. Now we want you to engage in the process of creation, which is a different process. So where does partnership start? And what kind of partnership are we actually talking about? So the Roskilde Festival, and I brought that slide for many reasons, not just because it's a slide of a scene that doesn't exist anymore. It had its last year, and this year's Roskilde Festival will have another main stage. But it's a festival in Denmark with 135,000 people on the festival site every day. 30,000 of them are volunteers. So 30,000, 1 of 4 is a volunteer, and 1 of 4 is volunteering very often in social interaction. It's social volunteering. So they create lounges, interaction, foods, environments, pop-ups, all kinds of social activities, which allows this enormous crowd of people, there are 5 stages, this is the main stage, to gather and to socialize. And when this festival runs, it's the 5th largest city in the country. And all the surpluses are reinvested into the community of Roskilde, into associations, into youth communities, into youth production. And in order to be able to deal with that, the city had to create a different approach to how they value and distribute the municipal money in terms of culture. So they have created a music policy structure, which is also about businesses, it's about participation, it's about social interaction, it's about democratic values. So they're trying to basically make use of that event in the formation of you could call it a cultural political Roskilde identity, which is kind of interesting. By computer. So you could say, from the very top, you could say we always talk about this as culture being about promoting a vibrant, independent cultural life in a local context or a regional or a national context. that it encompasses conditions for cultural creators and citizens' right to access culture. So it's very much about who creates it and their living circumstances and abilities and opportunities and backgrounds and levels, etc. But also, of course, more and more about who can access it, when can they do it, what is it they can access, how is it being framed, etc. In what context. The idea, the aim of cultural policy is that very often that culture understood as both the arts and the broader concept of culture should be a dynamic, challenging and unfettered force in society, which has freedom of expression as its basis, that everyone has the right to and must have the opportunity to participate in cultural life. And that is, of course, the UNESCO Convention that is kind of embedded in all 4 countries. But when we go down and we talk, right computer. When we go down and talk to people about it, we can see, well, that's not entirely true. It's far more complex than that. But overall, the focus is on cultural heritage, preservation and promotion of cultural heritage, including historic buildings, archives, etc. It's on art, of course, promotion of artistic expression, support for artists, artistic institutions and initiatives that promote development and creativity in the arts, the art policy. And importantly enough, in Scandinavia, and both in Denmark and Norway, who are part of the project, arm's length is part of the legislation. In Sweden, it's part of a set of recommendations from 1979, I think. Var det propositionen för kulturen, var den från 79?
Culture policy is official from 74.
74, yeah.
And the inquiry was from the late 60s until the early 70s.
Okay, 74. So, but even though it's in Sweden, it's a recommendation and not embedded in law, more than 95% of the institutions and the municipalities follow it. So you could say, overall in Scandinavia, it is embedded as a practice that everybody expects to be followed, whether you are the distributor of funds or a recipient. Accessibility is an increasing policy area, making culture accessible, this audience perspective, of course. School services. Diversity is an increasing area, and not just diversity as ethnic diversity, but also as social, gender diversity, political diversity, religious diversity. So it's an increasing intersectional understanding of how diverse we are as a society. We can also see that focuses on media and digital culture, that it includes regulation and support for the media industry, of course, and different cultural initiatives, film, television production, digital art, etc. And then there is these two last ones. Culture as an economic driver. That we have, both in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, we have municipalities and regions that really see culture as a significant cultural and economic driver that can really be part of a changing the understanding of a given society. In Denmark, one of the very large examples is the city of Aalborg, which is in the northern part of Götaland. It used to be a very shipyard, heavy shipyard industry, quite industrially heavy city, and it has, just like Malmö in a way, undergone a change from an industrial city with a very strong working class identity into something that is about knowledge production, far more fine-tuned, where culture is an important part of it, and the cultural infrastructure and cultural industries have become an important part of that transition. And then there is this about internationalization, that of course there is a focus about internationalization, and again pointing to you, Louise, that you had an initiative last year where we collaborated about internationalization of small municipalities in your region, and the importance of really helping small municipalities to understand that they have an international opportunity that might actually make them surpass some of the obstructions on a national level, which we also see in Norway and in Ireland specifically. Again, the UK is slightly different. And of course, with Brexit and all, they're really different. Yeah, time.
It's already almost 3 o'clock.
You have to.
Yeah.
Can I'll hurry. I'll hurry.
Yeah, we are
No,
just a
you're
bit
right.
delayed technical.
Yeah,
technical
sorry.
stuff, yeah.
But I'll
It's
hurry.
super interesting, but maybe it's also good to dialogue.
Yeah, it's very good to have the dialogue. So I won't run through all this, but
And coffee.
and coffee. So what we're trying to see is we ask the municipalities, for instance, where's your focus? And we can see that their focus is very much on reproducing the idiom of what is culture. We build the national narrative, we build museums, we still build concert halls, we still build city theatres, we still build temples for the believers to seek to. But we also see it as an identity matrix. We see culture as something that can help us develop our city by creating an infrastructure and attract, for instance, the creative class, like Holstebro, again, in your region. Culture as entertainment, of course, that is something that can entertain the masses, but also can put us on the map. Investment in culture, big festivals, big concerts, mega concerts, for instance. It's a social driver. When we see lots of initiatives taking place in Malmö, for instance, we can see that initiatives in Syria is also about creating opportunities for social change. Democratic Kit, it's an innovation machine. There's this understanding of the local and the global. It can be understood as a game changer, the case of Aalborg. So we can see when we talk with them, these are words that they use. These are references that they have, and they are completely intertwined. It's not a very clear either or, it's all of it, or parts of it, all combined, which is interesting. So it's loaded with values. When we ask politicians or policymakers or citizens, we hear that it's loaded with value. There's so many expectations connected to that field from everybody's side. So this shift is also interesting. Just see how many more I have. Are we getting close to the end here? So this shift is super interesting because the shift is in a way also driven by the digital shift, that cultural institutions today are no longer just for temples. This is one of the points from Ben Walmsley's latest report, that the shift is about that cultural institutions and operators also understand that the societal contract is not just about politics. The societal contract is not just about the formal framework in which we operate. The societal contract is also about institutions becoming more and more aware of the society outside of their doors, understanding the composition of citizens, understanding the drivers in their local community or their local neighborhood or their local circumstance, understanding the potential partnerships, understanding the needs of those they want to be relevant to, and engaging in it. And that's the shift. That is not enough anymore to communicate and understand. You have to engage. And you have to be able to operate outside of your walls, and you have to be visible in different spaces, on different platforms, in different circumstances. And that's a completely new thing, new in the sense that has happened after 2010. And that is now becoming more and more reflected in the formation of cultural policy. I'll leave those two, because that's taking too much time.
Sorry, Niels.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. So what you could say that the book that is coming now is trying to address these 8 points that we think that we as cultural researchers would recommend cultural politicians to be aware of. And just very, very fast, obviously we have to be aware of digitalization, understanding, not just talking about it, but understanding what that means in terms of developing a new cultural value system. We need to talk about sustainability or regeneration, or we need to understand that, and that is also already happening. We need to have a conversation about representation, inclusivity, and diversity on all levels, and understanding what that really means, especially if we are in the Nordic model talking about taxpayers' money. We need to understand the link between policy and the creative industries. The creative industries in Denmark, together with the cultural sector, is now the 4th largest contributor to our GDP. which is interesting. But I think it's more or less the same too. Internationalization, obviously. Integration of arts and culture into the educational system. There has been a kind of divider. How can we actually look at it as something that could be much more combined? Can we combine it in different ways? Can culture schools and music education into the formal educational systems collaborate much more, for instance, than they do today? The development of cultural policy as a matrix, like culture and health, like you did in Malmö with the Malmö Commission in 2012-13, could be something we would look into. And cultural economy, of course, the support for growth layers and cultural entrepreneurship should be one of the things that we recommend people, cultural policymakers to look into. Right, computer. So we are asking what new perspectives, means, and instruments can be used. We are just having a whole load of, so this is just an example of the questions, the research questions we are trying to what if cultural policy stood on two clear legs, an art policy and a broader cultural policy? What if cultural policy is both vertical and horizontal? For instance, the Malmö Commission or the Viken County in Norway. What if cultural policy sets out long-term structural development goals for the arts? What if cultural policy incorporates a clear use of technological advances such as VR, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, and blockchain to create new forms of cultural experiences, strengthen digital communication, and facilitate digital collaborations? What if? What if cultural policy strengthens the opportunities for the development of new formats, hybrids, and completely new expressions? And understanding that there's this other side of it, which is all about innovation, in a way. What if culture policy promotes the use of digitization technologies to preserve and make cultural heritage more accessible, including digitizing archives, virtual museums, and online libraries? Just so this kind of questions that we raise are basically questions we raise to create a dialogue. This is an embryo project. We see it as a project that should grow out and include even Sweden, Finland, maybe even the Benelux countries, to something that is really looking into cultural political infrastructure. So we're also asking, what if culture was critical infrastructure? And that's basically Morten's point. What if nobody in Lund should live less than 300 meters from a poet? Or how many culture houses should Copenhagen have to really cover the needs of its citizens, etc.? What would happen if it was a public demand that cultural policy is evidence-based? What if we started all over? Can we start all over? What if the Ministry of Culture was called something else? In Denmark, we have a joke sometimes that the real cultural minister, is also named the Minister of Finance. You know. So can we have a conversation about what we are talking about when we talk about culture? And I will end my presentation with a very short example. This is a newly opened space. It's just one part of the space. It's huge, but it's a space called Torvej 29 in Copenhagen, and it's a space that has been set with one very specific purpose: to address issues that are transversal, to see culture not in a pipeline, but to understand the potential of culture as something that really can break barriers, can break the fourth wall of participation, can create completely new understanding. It's funded by one of the philanthropic foundations that we are lucky to have so many of in Denmark. And it includes these goals: right computer, that it will address issues of democracy, issues of politics, issues of participation, sustainability, the arts, digital innovation, and social innovation. And interestingly enough, one of the biggest public funded actors, the National Gallery, the Statens Museum, of course, have already moved one of their task forces in there, because the opportunity for them to work in that kind of transversal network and platform is much bigger by being there than it would be to invite people into meetings in the big temple in the center of the city. So I think we all, and Torvald is just a Danish example. There's another one in Oslo. There's a good one happening in Kristiansand. There are good examples both in Ireland and in the UK. So we already see this kind of cross-sectorial, transversal collaboration framework being set up. So we will present a book which is basically raising a number of questions based on a mapping, you could say, on the mapping of what's the circumstance right now in Denmark, Norway, Ireland, and the UK. And then we hope that the Danish research fund that has funded the project this far will continue funding us for at least a coming 3-year period. That was it, folks.
Thank you.
Sorry,
No. Sorry?
when is the book
The book,
scheduled to publish?
we have a meeting in 2 weeks where we will see the first not the first draft, that has already been accepted and corrected. So it will be the first very fine example of the almost finished book before publishing. So it's on the stairs, it's really close.
It's out of the screen. We don't know, Rick is probably.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I know.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
Yes, no.
Yes. Okay.
Mark.
So I think that what was interesting in this context was this work I did last year and that I'm actually continuing on this year for the Culture Committee of Västra Götalandsregionen, Kulturnämnden, to investigate the rent models in the culture field. So I will be quite short, but I have one example in the end, and I think it's more interesting maybe if you have questions and so on. But given the very steep rise in inflation in 22 and 23, I was contacted by the region of Västra Götaland because their culture committee wanted to understand what is happening, what are the models, and the sort of the calculations in Sweden and also in other parts of Europe when it comes to securing spaces, public spaces for culture in Sweden. Because they heard a lot of cultural actors saying we can't afford the rents anymore. So I got this commission and I wrote this report that was presented early this year. Actually, if you go on the region's website, you can order a paper copy of this. I hold on to this very much because I managed to grab like a handful of them in Eskilstuna. But it's also available digitally. So it's there, and actually I wanted to write this kind of report because I recognize that there is probably a need for understanding these complex systems. And I won't go through that, but most of you probably understand the complexities because you know that there is not, just as Niels presented, it's not just the field of culture policy. You have many other administrations involved in this. So what I did was I looked at what is the public administration structural background and backbone of the rent models that are in use in Sweden in the culture field. How do they set the rent levels for cultural actors? What kind of owners of facilities where cultural actors rent spaces are there, private and public? And how do municipalities and also regions and the state relate both to public and to private culture actors? And they also wanted to know, are there any good models in Sweden or in other countries? So that's very much the content of this report. And I just wanted to mention also that I have been looking at the traditional culture field, but when I was in touch with Mike and Hanna here at Trans-Europe, I was doing research on the region. I was actually based at the region, the cultural administration of the region. I was looking at how they work with culture and creative industries policies. And I looked at Sweden, but from a European perspective, and I tried to understand why did governments start to engage with creative industries, which for me is an industry. It's not culture policy. And actually what this book basically looks at is, okay, how did the border between culture policy and regional policy, including industrial policy, how was that negotiated? Because what I see, and this is an intricate discussion we could engage in, I see that Swedish culture policy differs very significantly from both Swedish industrial policy, but also EU cultural policy. Because at EU level, I see this as an integrated policy sphere, whereas in Sweden, we have very clear lines between industry policy and culture policy.
Katja,
So, yeah.
when you say industry policy, you mean creative industry policy?
No, industry, näringspolitik,
Näringspolitik.
business policy,
Mm.
enterprise policy.
Yes, okay.
So, and this is very intricate because I think at the EU level, it's not divided. And I think actually what Niels was talking about, I think both in Denmark and in the UK, they don't separate them as clearly as we do in Sweden. And this for me was a big sort of question mark. I wanted to understand, how come we have cultural ministers in Sweden talking about the creative industries, which for me would be normal that would be something for the Ministry of Enterprise and Industry and Business. So this is where I come from. And in that sense, it was very interesting for me then to look at this issue of the spaces for culture and the rent models and the rationales behind this, because it means looking both at the private sector and the public sector. And then you know also that municipalities and regions and the state have public administration, but we also have publicly owned limited companies, which complicates things quite a lot. So this is what this report was about. And so, yeah, this is the report. And I also think it's interesting in this context that I have already presented some of this material at the Urban Studies Department at Malmö University. I will be presenting this report basically in English at the Urum conference this year and also at the Cultural Economics Conference. So this is kind of the context where I'm moving now. But yeah, and then just something about the material, but this is not so. This is more academic. We have to show what we will do and so on. Anyway, so to me, the region of Västra Götaland, what the politicians there have to think about is, okay, why do we give money to culture? Why do we spend money on culture to be doing things in spaces across our cities and our living environments and so on? And these are my words based on their commission to me as an evaluator or investigator. I see that their sort of challenge is how should they think about the cost-value ratio when thinking about funding the arts and culture, including spaces and support to rent costs and so on. How should they understand the living environments of cities, but also rural areas where you have both public and private actors? I think also Niels touched on that. What should the public sector do? Because they should not interfere where markets work well. But you know that society is more than the market. And that's the tricky thing. So the public economy has to deal with what can we leave to the private actors, what are we responsible for, and how should we act in those in-between spaces. And that's usually where culture is. So I think also Morten touched on that they have to find their way between these sort of the private and the public, which is perhaps more straightforward. How do we move in the in-between area? And you know that Morten also mentioned that very much, that it has a lot to do with the individual experiences, the sentiments and opinions of people living in a place, the communities and so on. This is what you negotiate with, and Morten was mentioning trust very much. This is what you have to manage from the public sector in relation to culture. And this is, of course, what the Culture Committee wanted me to help them with, to negotiate. And now I'm jumping. In order to make this presentation short, what I did was try to understand in different municipalities, at the state level and at regional levels. And I will explain this in a minute. How do they design rent models? And I started with municipalities and regions who are structured in the same way, because they usually hand out the culture policy grants to individual actors, both public and private. And what I found was, very much as has been mentioned already today, that in the public sector, you have an elected government at the top level, which is you would call it the municipal assembly. What's that?
Kulturutskottet.
Kulturnämnden,
Yes.
but above that you have the whole
The council, the city council.
the city council, but kommunfullmäktige.
Kommunfullmäktige,
Yes. So here you have the totality of elected politicians. Then, in Swedish traditional way, I know this is not the case in Denmark. In Sweden, we are very organized, so we organize the silos. You have the culture committee and the culture department, who is not communicating with the property committee and the property department. Yeah. You have the social committee and the social department and so on. Now, what is interesting is that culture committees get a budget that they can distribute to culture organizations in support for, among other, rent costs. So they are free, the culture organizations are free to go on the private market or the public market to rent whatever spaces they want. Okay, so this is a clear sort of very democratic system. The only problem is that there is no communication here. And what I found was that the property departments and companies, they of course had to react to inflation, which means they had to increase the rents. But the culture committee decides independently on the support culture, which means that individual organizations saw the rent going up, but the support from the culture organization was not following. And that was not because they were mean, but there was no communication. And you know that for the last 20 years, there has been basically no inflation in Sweden. So I think also this was a historical moment that people were not thinking about, that suddenly the inflation rose quite sort of out of the blue, more or less. And this is how they realized that there was something strange in this system. Now, some municipalities have thought about this. And I think this actually goes for Lund and Södertälje at least. I haven't looked at this. You know, there are 290 municipalities in Sweden. But I just spoke to a few of them. So some municipalities have tried to solve this dilemma by saying that, okay, all our municipal properties that we own, they are rented by the administrations. So the social administration, the school administration, the culture administration, they are renting from the municipality itself, all the facilities. And why do they do that? That is because they can then match the grants for the cost of facilities with the actual cost. I do think that there is a limitation, and that is they can only control this for their own facilities. But this is an option where you have control over costs and what you distribute to culture actors in terms of grants and so on. So what I see in Sweden is that municipalities use one of these two models, more so the first one than this one. And then, interestingly, I looked at, because I know IFU Center, this is a grassroots model that is also in the report. So this is not based in municipalities, this is based in cultural organizations, because I was interested in how do they do it in these independent organizations around Europe, where they are not public institutions. And what IFU Center, you probably know this, all of you, or but I don't think it's described in this kind of figure. What they do is that they actually are an association, so they are member-based, and they own their own property through a limited company. So they have a collective interest association that controls the tool, the limited company, for buying the property. And this is kind of a reversed, from a municipal point of view, a reversed system where they let out the spaces and earn an income from the rentals, where the surplus then feeds into the cultural activities. Now, you know that this is probably possible only for very few cultural organizations, because how many cultural organizations can afford to get a bank loan and buy a property? And this is what I see as a challenge. I know many organizations, both in Gothenburg and in Malmö and so on, they live basically on the grants they get from the municipality. So they can't even start to consider this kind of solution. And that is really the tricky question as I see it. And of course, the question for me is, you can't just hand out more money, because that doesn't solve any of these basic problems. Of course, the culture organizations are happy, but the politicians need to think about the public economy. And what is, as I started out by saying, what is the cost-value ratio in culture policy? How many cultural activities can you support with public culture policy and so on? Is it always possible to say that the more cultural activities we have, the more cultural spaces we have, the better? From an economic point of view, you would say that, at a certain level, you don't get more value out of more costs and so on. And this is not so nice to think about many times in the culture field, because that's not the way they are used to think. But from an economic and especially a political economic point of view, you have to consider this. So basically what I'm thinking about now, based on this report, and I'm thinking about writing papers about this, is, so how much is it reasonable to subsidize for a municipality, for example? And is it reasonable also, which I think is very much the German, the Swedish tradition. I think that in the Netherlands, they don't have this tradition at all, with one space, one cultural actor. So is it possible to think in new ways in Sweden about this? Would it be possible to think of cultural spaces where municipalities, for example, ask more actors to share the facilities? I think we have this sort of tradition in Sweden of being very generous on cultural policy grants that has led to a situation where you always try to get out more. And this is also quite difficult to discuss with the cultural field because naturally they think about their own activities and their own forms of expression, whereas it's more an issue for economists and for politicians to think about the whole society. So these are all questions that I don't have answers to, but I think are very important to think of, especially in the future. And I think Morten and Sebastian really sort of showed this in their presentation, that this is really what they struggle with. Now I don't know if I have time, but I was thinking about just giving you one example from Gothenburg, which is Konstepidemin, and I think Stenkrossen is a similar example. I don't know any of them very well, so I was looking very superficially at many different organizations, but I think this is interesting as an illustration of this dilemma that the municipalities in particular face today. So in Gothenburg, there is this center called Konstepidemin. It's based in an old hospital that was, I think, abandoned probably in the 70s or 80s, I don't know exactly, but the land was kept by the municipality of Gothenburg, but they had plans to demolish the buildings and exploit it in the future at some point. There were no clear plans for this. And then in the 1980s, some artists contacted the municipality and said, we would like to do some kind of cultural center in these spaces and so on. And so there are 14 buildings, and today there are studio spaces for around 130 artists. There was an agreement between this organization and association and the city of Gothenburg for a nominal rent. There were no calculations on the future costs because the city of Gothenburg had no plans for these buildings, so there were no costs. What happened in around 2010 was that the Gothenburg city revalued these buildings and said, these buildings are valuable, there's valuable things taking place there, we want to keep these buildings. And then what happens in municipalities is that you have to then come up with a plan, how do we secure these buildings? Because municipalities need to take care of their property, because it's not the municipalities, it's the inhabitants' property. So there are rules for sustainable property management, which means they have to be underhåll, they have to be kept and maintained and managed, which means restoration and so on. So paradoxically then, Konstepidemin now since a few years face a completely new rent situation where the municipality has said, okay, these buildings are valuable, we need to calculate a new rent level because the previous one was just, taken, which you did until I think maybe 20 years ago. Which then, of course, means that many of the artists who rent space now in these buildings will probably not be able to stay on. And the question, of course, is, okay, should the city increase the support for these artists or for these spaces and so on. And I think this is a paradox and a dilemma, because of course there is this principle of maintaining the properties of the city, and also the city of Helsingborg has a property company which is fully owned, but they work on market principles. So they rent spaces for activities within the city, but they are expected by the politicians to generate a profit. And what they do now is that HIGAB, they are called HIGAB, they are renting out some properties on a market rent basis, and then they subsidize rents to some cultural actors, but they have to take the difference on their own profits. So in any way you look at this is a challenge. So it's a challenge from the sort of municipal side, it's a challenge from the cultural side, and so on. And I actually don't know what will happen, but they tell me at Konstepidemin that probably, in the coming years, the type of actors that rent spaces will change quite radically. And then we are there, okay, what is happening? You can sell expensive apartments around this, but it will not be the same thing. And of course, for the artists, that's an identity issue, I would say. But even for the city, I think what I know, politicians, at least from the Stockholm area, some politicians think that it doesn't matter if it's more like creative industries being active here, or if it's artists. So there is also this kind of culture policy dilemma here, that maybe from the city point of view, it's not necessarily worse unless there is a Wayne's Coffee or Espresso House, So I think that there is still kind of this knowledge difference between people who are really engaged in the cultural field and people at the municipal level who are interested in having an attractive city. So, yeah, I want to end with this very cheerful situation, but I think this is really a challenge for cities. And I'm going next week up to Stockholm as part of this investigation, I'm continuing now to look at how are they working with that in Stockholm, just to see if they have any good models for working with this. Because I think in Sweden, Stockholm is the city that is furthest ahead, where they try to implement these tools called cultural maps and they have cultural plans and so on for new districts of the city and so on. But I think no one really has any answers to how to solve this dilemma. Yes. Dace? Yes.
Yes, but I just maybe letting you finish. It was just like for the Then I will have one question.
No, I actually think this was the last slide. This was the last slide. So I would actually open up. I don't have any consolating words to finish with. I think this is. But I think it's positive that at least some culture committees address this and want to see, okay, are there any interesting solutions? So maybe we can let Dace start.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting story. Thank you that you shared, and this cooperation with this cultural council is as well. That great that, as you said, that these kind of things are taking place. But I had like question, but does the cultural committee had any idea what it brought to the city, the fact that having these cultural institutions within this former hospital area, did any kind of measurements or evaluation processes were in place? So yeah, just
Yes.
to understand if it was worthy and what was the value of having these organizations and artists there.
Yes, thank you. A very good question. And actually, that is good that you bring that up. So I know that this is usually something that politicians and also civil servants ask. The problem is, I was talking also to Niels, that the problem with culture is that it's so complex as a policy tool that it is very difficult to link inputs with outcome. So we can say, for example, that we know that spaces with a lot of culture are attractive. But that's very far from saying that, okay, if we add more culture, then that will become attractive. And then you also have to say, okay, at what cost? Now, what I think in Sweden is so valuable, and the Nordic countries, is that we have this culture policy idea that we don't look at the evidence. We say that culture is important. That's why we spend money on culture. Whereas, I mean, talking about the UK, there they have skipped that sort of trust in culture and its values. They say, if you don't show the evidence, we will not give you any money. I'm generalizing a bit, but this is really a big difference. So, but that is also, that is one aspect. And the other aspect is also the thing that I was talking about, that a city is not only public sector or private sector. It's a mix of both. So the question becomes, okay, where's the value generated and who sort of benefits from that value? And we know that cultural actors generate value, economic value, but it's the hotels, it's the transport operators, it's the hotels, restaurants that get the money from people who go and visit these places. That's one argument for taxation and public subsidies of the arts. So in Sweden, I would say we are lucky because politicians in general agree that we recognize the value in culture. So we don't engage in that discussion about showing the value of culture. But it's a bit tricky. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that is also my dilemma as an investigator. They ask me to show, what are the calculations that shows the value of culture? And then I also have to say that when we talk about value, you have to separate political value, which means something that we consider important, and economic value. Economic value is the value on a market. And economic value is only realized in transactions. And the political economy and the market economy are not the same thing. So that's also a challenge. I'm sorry I'm confusing things even more, but I'm trying to answer your question. Is that somehow, does it help you or does it confuse you even more?
I must say it's a bit helping me and confusing as well. Now I'm like keeping on to reflect along while you are speaking. Yeah, I was like really wondering here more about this social impact that city sees the social impact of having like these kind of areas, these creative hubs or territories in their city. Just by curiosity.
And I will let Niels in, but I think that, I mean, we are lucky in Swedish municipalities to have had investment in culture that has these social effects. And I think Morten was also addressing that we already have this infrastructure of culture, and then we can see the effects. I think the other way around, sort of arguing for the social value of culture, I think that is not in the Swedish tradition. Maybe we can discuss this more, but I think it's a good question, and I don't think I have a good answer, straightforward one. But maybe we will let Niels
You were
Come
first.
in. Were you first? Okay, yes.
Just a short question. I was.
Okay, sorry.
Keeping the
Yes.
no worries. Just a quick question. Do you see a trend for the model like if the center is doing? I'm thinking about the initiative as Choose a Bag, for example, which is a new initiative where the community, they want the community to buy from a prison and also transform it to a cultural space. So it's another example of a model that is similar to the EFA Center.
Yeah.
So maybe, exactly.
No,
So if there is like, is this a coming trend or?
yeah. I think this is very interesting. You probably know these trends more than I do. I'm a researcher, I sit and write things, but it's very interesting. Last year, I tried to look at the Netherlands and also France, and they have some interesting models there, but this kind of research takes a lot of time. So IFE Center was the only model that I knew, and I knew there is this model, but I think the challenge is usually the economic challenge, and it would be very interesting to explore more. So I would definitely try to look at that.
Yeah, because it's Bakakok and it's an ongoing process right now.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting.
Slightly different MKBs,
Yeah.
but anyway,
Yeah.
I can.
I think actually, paradoxically, I think in Sweden, the sort of generous Swedish culture policy has meant that Swedish culture actors are a bit lazy. And this is really a paradox, because I hear people in the culture field from Southern Europe say, "Oh, it's so fantastic in Sweden. You have so much money." But then when you look at the innovation rate, of course, it's much higher in the Southern European countries because they don't have any money. They have to find these solutions. And I think also Teresa Holberg, she also had this experience of squats in Berlin. So I think we are not so innovative there, but that's because also we have a public support. So I think that's very interesting, but also a kind of dilemma. Yeah.
When you say innovation, you mean in the culture sector?
In the
right?
culture sector. So innovation meaning trying things out in new ways.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah, but coming back to Datya's question, because I think it's super interesting. When I was a museum director, at some point, I remember we went to Österlen, my board of directors, my colleagues and I, we made a lot of pancakes. We sat in a garden overlooking the beautiful landscape, and that's why I don't have any hair left, trying to understand what the politicians wanted us for. Because in a way,
Exactly.
he was at the same meeting. But because I think one of the paradoxes was there was a huge social expectation. There was a kind of social cultural policy already back then in the zeros. This was I was the director for Dunkus between 2002 and 2007. So there was a kind of, we should be part of a social development strategy that was never really articulated, but there was a demand on us. There was obviously a cultural political demand on excellence and reproduction and accessibility and the city's collection and fine art and all that stuff. But then, of course, there was also a surplus logic. There was a financial expectation that you are running a decent cultural business that will come out with a surplus, not with a deficit, but with a surplus. And the political rhetoric about the support we got about 30 million Swedish krona from the municipality, was that we are giving you 30 million Swedish krona. Nobody talked about the circular part of that economy. So we tried to look into that. We just, on a very, very non-research base, we tried to do some simple research, saying, okay, we get 30 million from that bag of money over here. How much money do we, circulate back into the bag in terms of rents? because it was publicly owned, and you said
Yeah,
they
yeah,
work
sure.
on market terms, and they
Yeah.
do. So how much of that is going back in terms of rent? How much is going back into the municipally owned energy supplier? How much is going back into taxes? And how many of our employees are actually living in the municipality paying taxes earned from those money back into? And it ended up, from a very non-professional research point of view, being more than 60% of the money was circulated back into the city.
Yeah.
And I so wanted a Swedish equivalent to the Weimar report that was made after Weimar was an ECOC, where they really followed with good, solid German, accuracy, every D-mark. Back then it was a Deutschmark. What is the investment actually looking at? What kind of commitment is it? Because it turned out, of course, we're super important for the local finance. Not only is a lot of money going back, but of all the other money, how much is then invested in local products, in local services, in local engagement, in local partnerships? Who's supplying the paper? Who's supplying the toilet paper? Who's supplying the food? Who's supplying all the things that an institution needs? And I think as a sector, we are simply super weakly equipped to take that debate and really qualify that debate. So that's a kind of, it hasn't been better since back then, 25 years ago. So that's the one comment, but because I think you're really touching on something that is super interesting. And in Sweden, for those of you who don't know, they restored the National Museum for an enormous amount of money recently, and then they found out they couldn't really pay the rent. So instead of rethinking the financial structure to a completely state-owned fine art, kind of highbrow fine art, state-of-the-art institution, they had to close it another day in the week.
But that's another. I can elaborate on that.
Please do.
What is interesting there is that the National Museum, Nationalmuseum, the National Gallery, actually,
Exactly.
They are not on a market rent contract.
No.
That was an exception to the state rent model, internal rent model. They wanted something that was not the ordinary model, because people heard the term market rent. So actually the paradox is that is a non-market based rent model, which generates this very awkward result, because it means that you don't spread the costs for investments over many years. You add the costs annually. So the actual costs, that's what happened with this renovation. Normally, when we buy a house, we take a loan, and then we renovate, and we pay the loan for 20 years or 30 years. With this model that was not supposed to be a market model, you have direct demands on payment, which is completely crazy. And this is what happened, but no one understood it. Right. So this was at the time criticized. I think it was a social democratic government. It doesn't matter. But so that also shows sort of the trickiness of rhetoric. You have to understand political economy to understand why this non-market rent model was actually worse than a market rent model. So this is kind of, and that's why I wrote this whole report, where most of it explains this is the legal, backbone of why the system works as it works. Because you need to understand these intricacies of adjustments for inflation within the state redistribution system. I mean, it's a huge job to understand. But the result is that you have this huge deficit, and media, of course, then says, look at this stupid government, they are creating this huge disadvantage for this single museum. And of course, the real issue is that it's not that simple, it's much more complex. But it is kind of, it shows the the level of complexity of this whole system.
It does.
Yeah. Sorry for
No,
expanding,
super.
but yeah.
Natalie.
There was this recent book that became in some circles a little bit like a new Bible. Culture is Not an Industry by Justin O'Connor.
Yes.
I don't know if you have come across
Yes.
that, which basically one of the biggest arguments that O'Connor puts into for the conversation or debate is that he proposes that culture should be a social good.
Yeah, yeah.
And that we need to, and his argument is built up on a very industrial, so to speak, approach coming from the UK, from the 90s, when it really started kind of creating this narrative that culture should pay, culture should be managed and imagined as a business model, as an entrepreneurship, etc. And how slowly also in the countries that were not questioning the social value of culture, it became more and more shaped by this idea of we need to show where it goes, those values, where are we distributing it back, etc. So what he tries to bring back is that culture should be being in this basic, it should be a basic need, and also a lot, and I hear it, and I think we all do hear it on many conversations, that people do still refer to an idea that culture is only there and valuable when we have already reached the basic needs. So only when the basic needs are covered, only afterwards you have the space, opportunity, time, also space mentally to engage in any sort of cultural experiences. Which O'Connor would argue that is a completely wrong approach, because this is not where culture comes in. Culture is not something that comes there only when things that are in place, and it's just an entertainment dimension of culture, but I mean, looking at culture more from the fundamental perspective. So it just came to just wanted to mention that also, because you were mentioning, if I understood well, that Sweden also traditionally politically has probably the same approach, that culture is not a questionable thing, and it's something. And another thing, I'm really not, I don't know how I feel about it. I don't have very clear opinion, but there is something that bothers me very much when I hear people saying that if you are supported, funded, you become lazy, or you are not innovative anymore, and you need to suffer in order to create, and you need to go through. And this is something I wanted to maybe hear a little bit more, or discuss a little bit more, how we actually think.
Should I start you? You start that?
Yes, I can comment. I have read Justin O'Connor and very many others. I have read a lot of the UK literature, especially actually when I wrote this. The thing is, the UK, I think I said that the UK has gone so much further than any other European country. So they basically, I mean, these are my personal words, they basically abolished culture policy. They have basically only industry policy. So I think what the UK, especially the cultural, the humanities researchers, they are reacting to a very market liberal policy towards anything in society. And for many years, I have problems with that, because we are not there in Sweden. So I think what they are trying to emphasize is very much, that culture is basic to humans. So we create culture regardless of economies and so on. So we have culture on the market, we have it with public subsidies, we also have it in the civil sector. we produce culture, and then economy comes in. So yes, I agree to that, but I think that kind of argument sort of starts in a way in the wrong end, I think, because it somehow departs from the very market liberal UK situation, I think. In Sweden, we see culture as very basic, and then because we see that the market has negative effects, that's why we support it with public subsidies. And in the UK, they have taken out that public part altogether. And then, of course, you get this argument. So I agree, but I usually don't. I refer to those authors, but my view is much more economic. So I try rather to explain that, okay, you have the public and the civil and the private sectors. The economies work in different ways and so on. And then I agree with you absolutely with what you say. And that's why I say that this is kind of, it becomes very awkward. But if we talk about new forms of trying to find an economy for culture, I mean, it's both a blessing and somehow maybe not negative, but if I know that money comes from here, I don't explore these other ways of making money because I stay with this. And I have very much respect for artists, but I also know they act in their own self-interest, which also other actors do. So I'm not sort of despising artists, but and that's why I also say that this is kind of a, you know, it's paradoxical for me that I say this, because of course I am very much in favor of public policies and so on, but I also see sort of in the other end what happens. I see the differences between Southern Europe and Sweden. We do much more culture here than in the South. On the other hand, when it comes to sort of finding new models, I see that there are many new models there, and I don't see that much. But that's from an innovation perspective, so you have to keep that in mind. It's not from a normal social or human perspective. So just to clarify that. And sometimes as a researcher, it's my job to provoke, so and to say these things that are not so comfortable. Even for politicians, it is important. So as a researcher, I am not dependent on any of you, and I think that's also that's also
Yes, right.
it is important that we have these different roles, that you can sort of lift these things and discuss them. So thank you for those comments. Yeah.
I embraced her because I was almost kicked out of my good network of fellow museum directors when I said that we are bloody lazy. For exactly that reason.
Yeah.
But we are. And that has to do with privileges. When I was the museum director, I got almost 80% of my funding annually by automatics. So the automatics in a way also confirmed the privileges that we had as curators, as programmers. So did we really did we find an interest in the social engagement, in the social political design of our city, in the pop-ups, in who curated what was actually being brought on stage of contemporary art? We did. Did we really listen to the artists? Because I think you have to make a distinction between artists, art policy, and cultural policy, the institutions. Because the institutions are part of a public framework. Whether they are private or public, they are part of a public framework. And they are lazy. If the money comes by automatics, then you have to force them to think out of the box in the regulations, in the agreement, because if you don't, privileges, any kind of privileges, will in a way get in the way of development. That has happened to me. I've made all the mistakes you can make, and even tried to make more than is possible. Because you reproduce logics that just is about excellence or artistic insights, or without really fully understand the context that you operate implemented. And I think that is a laziness that is about the societal contract of the institution. And there's nothing wrong with giving money to institutions. I love it. I'm also strongly in favor of public funding. But they should ask more of the institutions. They should make sure that the institutions are far more aware of their democratic responsibility. That is not the same as saying every theatre should be relevant to every citizen. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying they have to be more interested in their role in the next production of Strindberg. That's not the case. They're far more interested in the next production of Strindberg than they are in their role in society. And that is a problem. That is really a problem.
Well, I can add on to that, if I may, being 10 years in between orchestras and politicians. And lazy might be a strong word out here. It's demotivating.
Yes.
And just to support Niels, orchestras in the Nordic region, they get probably 80 to 85% of their funding automatically. And then the narrative is that the ticket income, the last 15%, they can spend that for soloists and conductors. And all the effort is directed towards earning those 10 to 15% instead of having a dialogue, constant dialogue with the real supporters of the institution. So dialogue, and it's very hard to create because it takes two to a dialogue. And if the orchestras that I've represented, they were just angry and nobody understands us and we're doing fine art and politicians are just generally stupid. It's not a good way to start a dialogue. And the politicians, they tell me, the orchestras are stuck in the 1850s where Bismarck was ruling Germany. They haven't changed 8 things since. That's a very hard start of a conversation. And then the politicians, they have the hard end, they have the money, so they say, okay, we're just not giving you anything else until you change. But it's kind of an open question because you don't know what do we need to change, so they're kind of on a bare ground. And when you start then to introduce what we said today, audience engagement, they don't have a clue. Not really. I mean, and it's business thinking. I mean, if Coca-Cola lost their funding, they would have a board meeting for like 14 days and come out with 17 strategies to how to earn money again. And many art institutions, they go in some kind of a fetal position and just hope the storm goes over and something must be done. So it's a mindset change, and the recipients of all the money have to take charge in that, change the mindset and change the discussion with the political level. And be open to, as Niels said, what role do we play in society? And that's more than just playing the next Schoenberg piece because we think Schoenberg is fine and we need to educate our audience. We need to listen to the audiences. What do they want to hear? And what kind of experience and what kind of feeling do they want? It's about changing a lot of things. My thoughts.
Star Wars.
Well, that's good for some parts of the audiences. You need strategies for many segments. And don't hope they play enough Star Wars for them, they will start touching Brooklyn. That's not the case. They will hear more Star Wars, and that's fine. Diversify your business.
Should we say last 5-7 minutes, and so Natalie can take over? I mean,
we are more than 1 hour behind schedule.
Yes, exactly.
Only 1 hour.
1 hour and 50 minutes, I think, behind schedule. So we need to move on.
That's what you want to say.
Yes.
Perfect. Please, yeah.
I think this is going back to your presentation, Niels. As we already mentioned, or you mentioned, I kind of oversee 19 municipalities as my playground, and I can see that coming back to the cultural policy and the development of the cultural policies at the municipality level, I can see that there's a top-down approach from some municipalities. There's perhaps 7 out of my 19 have a very top-down, and then the others are bottom-up, where the cultural departments are very small and supportive of the cultural institutions. And I know which model I would prefer if I were a cultural actor. But do you see any kind of like development in this top-down, bottom-up approach? And where are we going? Do you think?
I think one of the most interesting experiments in terms of cultural policy right now is taking place in Greater Oslo in Norway. Exactly that. What kind of funds should be top down? What kind of linear political structure should we have in order to distribute money? What is that for infrastructure, or is it for certain kinds of programming? Or so that's one part of it. Then, because it's all the municipalities around Oslo, and some are municipalities with a huge ethnic and cultural and religious diversity, and some are very well-off municipalities with a very homogeneous society composition in terms of citizens. And so what they're trying to do there is also to say, what are the needs of every one of these municipalities, because they're different. So instead of having a one-off as a region, they say, what are the needs in Agder? And is that the same need that you might have in Bærum or in one of the other municipalities? And how can we meet these needs? That has to be a bottom-up perspective, because it has to rely on questions that the region forms to the municipalities about the needs of their citizens. And in some of the cases, the municipalities are very brave. They say, well, we are not going to answer that. We're going to distribute that question to the people that you're actually asking. So they're distributing to all kinds of cultural operators, having open hearings with feedback that then goes back to the region. I don't see that anywhere else in the Scandinavian countries. I think that's super brave. But I don't know where it's going to take them, because they've only been doing it for a few years. So, but I think that is one. So I don't think it has to be an either or. It has to. I still think politically we have to insist that culture is important for many different reasons, and there are maybe even an infrastructure we would like to maintain. But in terms of process and distribution and projects and initiatives, it has to be bottom up, because things are happening everywhere right now on so many platforms that the structure itself is old-fashioned in most municipalities and regions. But I think it's the only example I really can find. I know too little about Helsinki, and a lot of things I hear is going on in Finland, but we should ask Marcin Kowalski.
They just cut the cultural budget.
Yeah, they did. They were brutal, but it's the army, isn't it?
It's the army.
Yeah.
I think this is interesting. Just a very short comment. There is always a risk in doing this kind of experiments, and that is that it ends up somewhere where they don't want to be, and then they are easy targets for criticism for wasting public money. So I think that is also one reason for why the public sector tends to be conservative, which I also think is they need to know what they are doing, because we also see in the US now, when you're not knowing what you're doing. So I mean, that's always the dilemma also of the public sector, that you need to be able to say that we are using your money wisely. So how can you be conservative and then innovative at the same time? That's also a dilemma for the public sector actors.
No.
Okay. Okay, so I was thinking that maybe I can share with you a few things that are happening in Brussels now that are important, that connect very much also to the conversations that we had from building the cultural policies at the EU level, or the cultural frameworks at the EU level, and which is very much also related, of course, to the funding for culture in the European Union. That we are almost finalizing the funding period of EU budget, which normally lasts for 7 years. So EU works with 7-year
budget that is called Multi-Annual Financial Framework for nerds in Brussels, like we are, or MFF, and that is reviewed every 7 years, and the next time it will be reviewed in 2027, and so as of 28 we will have a new budget for Europe that will decide how much investment at the European Union level goes to which aspects of our lives, including culture. So I will touch on two of those aspects. So from one hand, the policy strategy framework for culture that is in the making in Brussels right now, and that connected with the budget conversations. So that's, you may be aware also because of all the developments that we are seeing in and out and across the ocean and on both sides of it. There are basically three topics that are dominating very much the conversation in Brussels, the European Union right now. It is competitiveness. So how to make sure that Europe remains competitive in the global context, and it becomes more and more acute, of course, now with the new trade wars being shaped and developed and taking different turns, etc. So how to make sure that Europe is not being cut off from this global kind of conversations on competitiveness, and make Europe still interesting for everyone to invest, to live, to be part of it, but also be competitive on the or globally. Another big topic that dominates, and obviously for obvious reasons, is defense and security. And what and how European Union should do in order to make sure that we are prepared for whatever may or may not come. And of course that has direct implications on where Europe is thinking of forwarding its investments when it comes to the next European budget period. And the third big topic is democracy, or the erosion of democracy within Europe, that is also kind of pushed or manipulated from outside of European Union, and how to make sure that we do enough as a European Union to uphold the democratic values that we are. It will come probably. That we want to maintain. So these are the three really big topics that are at the conversation in Brussels at the moment. I mean, obviously culture is not there, and it has never been, and I mean, it's not something that we would ever expect it to be there, but you will see as well that there are really big and heavy issues that are at the table, and we need to find the ways, and this is what we as Culture Action Europe, we are trying to put our head around to see how we can bring up the cultural conversation or cultural proposals to all those big topics that are at the table. And I will come back to that, where and how our thinking develops in that dimension. Now, if we zoom into more kind of a cultural focus in Brussels, the big thing is Culture Compass. You may or may not have heard about it. So Culture Compass will be the next strategic framework for Europe, for culture in the EU, and it wants to be really a guiding strategic principle that puts. I mean, we talked about culture plans and programs, so the same kind of strategic documents that the cities may develop, but now at the European level. So what should be really the topics that we want to address when it comes to culture and cultural policy making in the years to come at the European level? And that will guide very much, whatever we'll make into this cultural compass will guide very much, for example, the I don't know, objectives of the Creative Europe project. So what should be the objectives that the cooperation project or whatever you are putting together that it needs to address? Will that remain as we have now? For example, what do we have now? Innovation and cross-border collaboration. Will it have the dimension on that your culture project should be addressing the issue of climate or democracy or gender, or what is it?
I'm just thinking how we can address the issues of security.
The issues of security, I mean, that will be coming up. Resilience will most probably will make it into those conversations as well. So how, very, very, very possible. And also more and more probably, if we take into account this really strong competitiveness conversation or the framework that we have, probably what we're going to see that I'm speculating a bit, but what we may see is also that the economic arguments of culture comes back strongly also, and that we need to also show the evidence and show that our projects are contributing to security or to competitiveness, etc. So it is an important, it is an important document in itself, because that will define quite a lot of what we do, especially if we are cultural operators that are engaging somehow with the European policies and European funding. So that's interesting. So the EU Commissioner for Culture, and he has other things also in his portfolio like youth and intergenerational fairness and sport, from Malta, Glenn Mikalev, was the one who was tasked by the President of the European Commission to come up with this culture compass. So it's his kind of baby, or he needs to figure out what this culture compass should look like. Now, luckily, maybe because he's new, or maybe he's less experienced, or maybe he's whatever, he seems to be open to listen in. So he has launched the consultation process. He has somehow hectically invited and not really invited everyone in Brussels, and this consultation, the way how it was built up, formed, was there are many questions that we can ask. But in any case, what they claim is that they are listening, they want to hear, they will launch, so they had this consultation where they invited selected networks and cultural organizations that they listened in. And based on that also, or following that, anytime now they also should open a survey. That will be an online survey for cultural organizations to propose their visions on what they want to see in the culture compass. So we will, what we are preparing ourselves to, and that's kind of a promise from us, that we will develop a guide how you could answer the survey, which is sometimes maybe difficult, or it's not very clear, it's very bureaucratic, it's very user-friendly platform, etc. So we are thinking at Culture Action Europe in the team to prepare also a guide how our members could engage with the survey, because this is very, this is important, because we need to be very outspoken in shaping this the compass. And we are expecting that it will happen somewhere end of this year. So the Commission should come up with their proposal what this compass will be. Already we are here. Well, basically they say we don't know what it will be, and it's very covered in mystery of what they want. But you hear quite a lot of same things that is being publicly repeated also by the Commissioner and by the Commission colleagues, and we are almost sure that things like Working conditions will be within the cultural sector will be one of the big topics that will remain. I mean, it's kind of now there already, not in Compass, but in the policies, and it will remain and will be strengthened. And as Mikalev likes to talk all the time, if here we had the living next to the poet, for Mikalev is like art should pay your rent. So that is also kind of an approach that artists should be paid and should be earning decent wages, etc. So working conditions is one of the big things that will be happening. And another big thing that we see would be most probably related to democracy and cultural contribution to democracy. There have been two probably reference documents if you want to go and dive into that. The ongoing European Agenda for Culture, which is an existing now strategy for culture at the EU level, developed in 2018. So pre everything, so very outdated. So that will be a new answer. Culture Compass will be a new answer or a new European Agenda for Culture. And then so agenda now has really a topics or trends or more theoretical approach. And Compass will remain the same, so it will be more kind of overarching. And then based on the agenda now and Compass in the future, every year or every 3 years period, they will develop the work plan for culture. So work plan is then really the action. So what kind of actions EU will be doing on which topics? Will there be the coordination among member states to discuss the working conditions, to discuss security, to discuss democracy, socially engaged arts, maybe. So these actions will come once we have the Compass. So also it's good to think about the Compass not only as a big strategy and all the good things that we can couple in and put there, but also what kind of real actions that we want to get out of this. And then here comes the MFF. I quickly already said that. So the next EU budget, 2034. And this is a long process. It's a very long process. It has started already now. It should be finalized by end of 2027 as the latest, because we need to have the new budget in place to start 2028. We know, and it's a very complex balancing act. So in terms of how it works, it's the Commission that proposes the first proposal that will be expected sometime this summer, that the Commission comes up with their first proposal of how the multi-annual financial framework should look like, and then it's being negotiated for months among the member states. So basically the main decision makers are member states. So it will be the Council that will discuss and over again. And it changes any time, and it takes all the different directions. And you think that we are almost there, and it might just kind of be changed really literally from one day to another. So that will be an interesting adrenaline for surely for colleagues at Culture Action Europe to kind of follow and see where we will be standing. What are we particularly looking into and are interested into looking at the multi-annual financial framework is, will there be funding and investment for culture, and where and under which conditions, and obviously how much. Everything also in the European Union is very much now about novelty, and we need to rethink ourselves, and we need to become much more simple, and simplification is a big word. We need to be so that people understand, because we also want to understand ourselves, and we need to simplify. So they are also simplifying the budget, and the simplification boils down that there will be 3 pillars of the budget. One will look into what they're calling the competitiveness fund, so everything that makes Europe competitive, all the actions that makes Europe competitive, and funding for those actions will more or less, this is the logic of thinking, that's where everything will go into the competitiveness funds. Then we have the national plans, and national plans will really work more, it will be really more flexible term that very much like what the European Union did post-COVID, when they have invested in some national actions. That would support, revitalization of the economy, of societies, of culture, etc. And then the third one is on external action. So what EU should do and fund it when it comes to the internal action funding. So this is the simplification, if it is at all simpler. And there was we still officially don't know where the programs that are interesting for us, like that we as a cultural sector normally are applying to, like Creative Europe, Erasmus, Horizon, serve the citizens engagement. So where will they be? Will we still have them, or we will not have them? Will it be blended somewhere in those 3 pillars? Will Creative Europe become a competitiveness fund? Will it go there because maybe we are building this new narrative that culture makes Europe competitive, maybe? Or will that go to the external action funding, or where is Erasmus? And so all those questions are in the air. We officially don't know, but what we know, and we have seen the latest leak. Brussels is famous of its leaks as well, so all the time there are leaks, and everyone in town knows the most secret documents that are coming from the institutions. So we have seen the latest leaks, and we were happy actually, because in this leak at least we see that Creative Europe, Erasmus, Serve, Horizon, they still exist, so they are not off the list, and they are, as we call them, self-standing, so they are not mixed with anything. So if nothing changes, and everything can change, if nothing changes, we should possibly still have Creative Europe, Erasmus, Horizon, and Serve in 2028. Okay, so that's kind of good news for now. How much and what, we don't know. These details we don't know, but we are of course going out with preemptive strike, and we are already calling and demanding. This is bad. Demanding on like what should be done. I probably give you that as a. I will start with something lighter. So what we have been thinking at Culture Action Europe was how we can react to what is happening. So how we can react to these 3 big priorities of competitiveness, democracy, security. On the other hand, how we can see arguments that we can come up towards the policymakers to start this dialogue on how we can, as a cultural sector, contribute to those identified priorities, which on a larger extent, we agree and we share, and we think that yes, of course, these are important big topics that the European Union should address, and that is a starting point. So, but how we can bring the cultural contribution to that, And by doing that, by bringing these arguments, justify that we are asking for cultural investment at the EU level. So we have come up with this, our recent, very, very new campaign. If you haven't seen it yet, I'm happy to share it with you now. So it's called Ask, Pay and Trust. And I think those three words have been also very much present in today's conversation for a reason. Those three concepts are also very much stemming from the report that we recently published, State of Culture report, that identified also in a larger extent the challenges of the sector, which is very much aligned with the fact that we are never being asked, or we are never being part of the really any political conversations or decision making. Paying artists still remains a big challenge in many different countries of Europe, and the question of trust, or rather mistrust or lack of trust, which is kind of a very organic trait of the sector, or towards the sector from other stakeholders. So we are kind of trying to show the European institutions that we are ready to contribute, to work together with you to achieve those big questions of competitiveness, democracy and security. But in order to be able to do so, we need those basic conditions. We really need those basic conditions to be in place in order for us to be kind of instrumental to what you do without being instrumentalized. So we have launched this campaign that are open for endorsements. If you want to take the QR codes, it will take you to our page, I believe. And there you can also endorse, and will be fantastic also if you can share it with your members and with your partners, etc. Because we really want to collect also the numbers behind this campaign, also to use these numbers in our advocacy work towards the institutions. As part of this campaign, we will be also developing a number of very practical tools that may be helpful also for your work at different levels that you work. So I already mentioned that we will, once the survey on Cultural Compass is out, we will develop a guide for you to use if you want to. There is a survey around the next European budget, so MFF, which is already out. And it also has the cultural aspect of this survey, and we have also developed the guide on how to fill in, basically step-by-step guide, how you could fill in this survey. If you don't know how to answer, you can always refer to the guide, also available for publicly on our website, so invitation to check it out. And we, because especially the budget decisions, I said, at the end of the day, are being made by the member states, by the ministries of finance, of mainly of your own countries. It's really extremely important also that the national advocacy is taking place. So there is as much as you can do at the European level, but it really needs to be fueled from the national advocacy. So from that perspective, we will also, they are not there yet, but they are coming up, that we will have the template letters for the ministries that you can use, translate, adapt, and make sure that also the calls that we are putting forward are also the same. And the biggest call of this campaign is to invest 2% of MFF in culture for the next campaign. And then I will not really bother you with this, because I don't think this is humane to do on the at 5 p.m. in the evening.
It's about security.
Yeah, but here, and that you can see also on our website. So basically what we try here are that we bring, I mean, apologies for that, being very visual, that distracts me a lot. But anyway, competitiveness, it says here.
It's very EU.
Yeah,
I wonder what they mean there.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically what we're trying to do is to create like a very short and clear argument how culture can contribute here in competitiveness on a more sort of a narrative level. And then we are then going through, because this is what the EU policymakers want to see, and we are playing this double game, of course, of hearing from what culture sector wants on one hand, and then translating it into the language that is understandable, acceptable for the EU institutions. Then we are looking into the really specific EU frameworks, where we are proposing that, okay, if you do this small change in this framework and talk about minimum standards to guarantee fair working conditions for artists at the EU level, we are good. So you have already kind of included culture in that policy framework. Or when you are talking about competitiveness fund, you need to also be thinking that maybe you should include artistic research, because you're talking about research, but nowhere ever you are mentioning or talking or considering artistic research as a way, as a valid method. Or what about AI policies, and how does that relate to the work of the cultural sector? What are our problems, or what are our questions when it comes to that? And of course, there is a lot of like safeguarding the unauthorized use of the works of artists, and them not being paid, and AI being trained on the work of the artists, etc. So, and what they can do really in terms of frameworks. And this becomes super technical, of course, but this is really very much directed to them, and we are offering also the spaces where they can bring that in, and so on and so forth. So the same approach on democracy, and then same approach on security and defense. And you will see that those we very much hope also, and that was partly also consulted, partly also digested of what the conversations we have already had with the members and with our communities, and also in other setups, and kind of trying to distill it and make it also relevant to the conversations. But this is not a closed document. We are running also, I mean, we were supposed to also have more activity afterwards, but okay,
let's have that.
Yeah. So if we can still have the activity, will be fantastic, because we also want to make sure that what we need really are some of the cases or some of the good examples that we may have at the national or regional level that may be upscaled at the EU level. And that will be really, really actually helpful also for us to see what we could offer them as a real, as a real threat. So I will explain you more. So no, we want. Sorry.
Jobs coming out there. We have something to do.
We are just putting you into action.
Yep. Mushy brains.
Mushy brains.
No, I mean, it's not really, we can also skip it, or it's not that everyone, if you don't have ideas or suggestions, but we just thought would be good if there are, any examples that we could use as cases, or say, I don't know, larger Oslo is doing that way, and maybe that can be something that we could scale up at the EU level as well, because this experience already exists and it works. So why won't we take the same approach also within those policies? So again, here we are looking again. Think about, we don't need to break out. We don't need to do all that. So we do it in the plenary, and we can think if the ideas come. On first topic will be on competitiveness, and what we are looking here is working conditions, social innovation, artistic research, creative industries, and AI and digital transformation. So if we have any successful or interesting, it doesn't necessarily may be in full implementation phase. It can be also at the idea phase, initiatives that can be scaled up. So when it comes to, I don't know, working conditions, and I would think, for example, I don't know, some countries in the EU, Ireland has piloted the.
That was my example.
Oh, sorry,
No,
just
say.
Ireland piloting the basic income for artists, for example, right? These kind of things that we are trying to collect. So if that sparks any ideas, any thoughts that you want to share now across the on the table, and maybe we can make the notes on the post-its that it does not.
Of course.
Yeah.
I don't know.